The letter that changed Minnie Sawyer's life forever was not written by her hand, and the man waiting at the train station in Caldwell, Kansas, already knew it. It was the spring of 1882, when the whole desperate plan had begun to take shape in the cramped back bedroom of a boarding house in St. Louis, Missouri, where two sisters sat across from each other with a single candle burning between them and the sound of rain hammering the tin roof overhead. Minnie was 23 years old, brown-haired and possessed of a quiet intensity that people often mistook for coldness until she smiled. And when she smiled, the whole room shifted somehow, like sunlight breaking through cloud cover. Her sister Clara was 26, fair-haired and luminous in the way that drew men's eyes in every room she entered. And it was Clara who had placed the advertisement in the Matrimonial Gazette, seeking a husband of honest character and steady income in the Western Territories. The advertisement had brought a response from a man named Phineas Finley of Caldwell, Kansas, who ran a cattle operation of modest but respectable size just south of town, and who had written in a plain, straightforward hand that he was 30 years old, had never been married, owned 160 acres outright, had no debts of consequence, and was looking for a wife of good character who was not afraid of hard work and wide open spaces. He had included, somewhat awkwardly, that he enjoyed reading when the day's work was done, that he kept a dog named Barley who was mostly useless as a cattle dog but excellent company on cold nights, and that he hoped whoever answered him would be patient with a man who was better at doing things than saying them. Clara had read the letter 3 times and then laid it on the bed between them and said, very quietly, that she had changed her mind. Minnie had stared at her sister for a long moment. The candle flickered. Somewhere down the hall a baby was crying. "You cannot simply change your mind," Minnie had said. "You placed the advertisement," he responded. "He is expecting a reply." "I know it," Clara said, and she had the grace to look ashamed. "But there is a man here, Minnie, a bookkeeper at the shipping company. He has asked to call on me, and I think I love him already. I know that sounds foolish. I know I have only spoken to him twice, but I know what I feel." Minnie had looked at the letter again. She had read it slowly, as though encountering it for the first time, though she had already read it twice over Clara's shoulder. There was something in the way the man wrote that struck her differently than she expected. He was not flowery. He was not performing. He simply said what was true and let it stand without ornament, and there was in that plainness something she found more moving than 100 pretty speeches. She thought about the bookkeeper in St. Louis. She thought about her own circumstances, which were not good. She worked as a seamstress, and her eyes had been troubling her for the better part of a year, and she knew that without her eyesight her livelihood was nothing. She was not getting younger. She had no prospects in St. Louis that amounted to anything real. "Let me write back," she said, before she had fully decided it. Clara looked at her. "As yourself," Minnie hesitated. The hesitation was the longest moment of her life up to that point. "No," she said at last. "As you, at least at first, just to keep the correspondence going while you sort yourself out with this bookkeeper. If it comes to nothing with him, you can take it back. And if you truly want to go to Kansas, you can take it back then too." "And if I don't?" Clara asked. Minnie picked up the letter. "Then I suppose we will cross that bridge when we come to it." It was a foolish plan. She knew it was a foolish plan even as she agreed to it. But loneliness has a way of making a person agree to things that good sense would otherwise refuse, and Minnie Sawyer had been lonely for a long time. The letters that followed were among the most remarkable of her life. She wrote as Clara, she signed them Clara Sawyer. She described Clara's appearance, Clara's history, the color of Clara's hair, but everything else in the letters was herself. Her observations about the world, her habit of thinking too hard about small things, the way she felt about open country, having grown up in Illinois before the family moved to the city, the way she remembered the smell of cut grass and the sound of wind moving through a field of wheat, and how the city had never fully replaced that sound in her heart. She told him things she had never told anyone. She told him about her father dying when she was 15, and how she had been the one to hold the family together while her mother grieved, and how she sometimes wondered if she had used up all her softness in those hard years and had nothing tender left to offer. He wrote back with equal honesty. He told her about his own father, who had driven the family west from Ohio when Phineas was 12, and who had died of a fever 2 years after they reached Kansas, leaving Phineas to learn ranching from neighboring men who were sometimes generous and sometimes not. He told her about the land, the particular quality of light in the late afternoon when the sun came low over the grassland and turned everything gold and amber and something almost too beautiful to look at directly. He told her about Barley the dog, who had destroyed 3 pairs of his good boots and shown no remorse. He told her about the loneliness of the plains, which was a different kind of loneliness than city loneliness, wider somehow, cleaner, less suffocating, but no less real. 6 months of letters. 6 months of Minnie Sawyer pouring herself onto pages addressed to Phineas Finley and signing them with her sister's name. Clara had in the meanwhile become engaged to the bookkeeper, whose name was Gerald Holt and who was, by all accounts, a decent and gentle man. She told Minnie this on a Wednesday evening in October and then looked at her with an expression that held both happiness and guilt in equal measure. "You have to tell him the truth," Clara said. "I know," Minnie said. "You have to tell him before anything else goes further." "I know that too." What Minnie did not tell Clara was that she had already told him, or rather, that she had tried to, in a letter she had written and rewritten 4 times and finally sent in its most honest form, explaining that she had been writing under her sister's name, that everything she had shared was true except for that name, that her name was Minnie and she was the younger sister, and that she would understand completely if he wished to end the correspondence. The letter she received in return had taken 11 days to arrive, which were 11 of the worst days of her life, during which she slept poorly and sewed crooked seams, and snapped at Clara for leaving wet stockings on the washroom floor. When it came, it was shorter than his usual letters, but it was the letter she kept for the rest of her life. He wrote, "I have been thinking about how to answer you, and I have decided that the only honest thing I can do is be honest in return. I knew, not from the first letter but from the 3rd or the 4th, I knew that whoever was writing to me was not the woman who placed the advertisement. I do not know how to explain how I knew, except to say that the person in those letters was someone I felt I was truly meeting, not someone performing a role. And it seemed to me that a woman performing a role would not have said the things you said, would not have wondered aloud about whether she had used up all her softness, would not have told me about standing in the kitchen at 15 years old telling her younger brothers that everything was going to be all right when she did not believe it herself. I did not say anything because I did not want to frighten you off. I did not say anything because I wanted to keep reading what you wrote. I want to ask you something and I want you to think on it seriously. I would like you to come to Caldwell, not as Clara, as yourself, as Minnie. I have a house that needs a person in it and I have a life that needs a partner in it, and I believe, though I know this is a large thing to believe about someone I have only met in letters, that you might be that person, if you are willing, only if you are willing." She read the letter standing in the boarding house hallway and then sat down on the floor right there, which was not something a respectable woman did, and did not care in the slightest. She wrote back that same evening and said she was willing. The train from St. Louis to Caldwell ran through the tail end of a cold April, and Minnie sat in the 3rd car from the back with her 2 traveling bags and her mother's old sewing kit, and a bundle of his letters tied with a piece of cotton string, watching the landscape change from city to farmland to something wilder and emptier than she had expected, even though she had grown up in the countryside. Kansas was different. Kansas was a different scale entirely. The sky here seemed bigger than sky had any right to be, pressing down on the flat grassland that stretched in every direction without interruption, and the towns they passed through were small and raw and new-looking, like things that had only just decided to be towns and might change their minds. She had worn her good dress, the dark blue wool with the cream collar that she had made herself the previous winter, and that fit her better than anything she owned. She had done her hair carefully that morning in the mirror of the Topeka Hotel, where she had spent the previous night, pinning it up in the way that she felt suited her face, and she had looked at herself for a long time in that mirror, and tried to determine what a man who had been expecting her sister would see when she stepped off the train. Clara was beautiful in an obvious, immediate way. Minnie was something else. She had good cheekbones and dark eyes that people occasionally noticed, and she had been told more than once that she was handsome rather than pretty, which she had always taken as a neutral observation and not a compliment, but which she had decided this morning to take as a compliment because she needed all she could get. The train pulled into Caldwell at 2:30 in the afternoon on the 14th of April, 1883, and Minnie Sawyer picked up her bags and walked to the door of the car on legs that were not entirely steady. The platform was not crowded. There were perhaps a dozen people on it, a few men in working clothes, a woman with a small child, two men in the dusty canvas coats and worn hats that she had already come to associate in her mind with the word cowboy, though she had grown up thinking of cowboys as figures of exaggeration. They were real, she saw now. They were simply men who worked cattle and wore their work on them in the way all working people did. She stepped down from the train and looked. She recognized him before he recognized her, or rather, before he showed that he recognized her. He was standing at the far end of the platform, a little apart from the others, and he was exactly as she had imagined him and entirely different from how she had imagined him simultaneously, which was the strangest sensation. He was tall, genuinely tall, with the kind of height that comes with a long back and long legs, and he wore a dark coat over a plain shirt and a hat with a worn brim that he was holding in both hands rather than wearing, which struck her as oddly formal and touching. His hair was dark and needed cutting. His face was angular, all planes and angles, not conventionally handsome but interesting in a way that she found far more compelling than conventional handsomeness, because it was an honest face, the kind of face that would not be able to lie without showing it. He was watching her. He had been watching her since the moment she stepped off the train, she realized, and his expression was, she could not entirely name it. It was careful and intent, the expression of a man reading something very important very slowly to make sure he got it right. She walked toward him. There were 20 feet between them, then 15, then 10. "Mr. Finley," she said. "Miss Sawyer," he said. And then, after a beat that held a whole conversation in it, "Minnie." It was the way he said her name, just her name, not Clara, not a question or an accusation or a test, just her name, said in a quiet voice with something in it that felt like recognition, like he was meeting someone he had already known for a long time and was simply now getting to put a face to. She felt her throat tighten in a way she had not expected and was not prepared for. "You knew," she said, "not a question." She had known he knew from his letter, but hearing herself say it aloud, standing on this platform in Caldwell, Kansas, with the April wind picking at the hem of her dress, made it real in a way it had not been before. "I knew," he said simply, "and you asked me anyway." "I asked you because of it," he said, "because whoever was writing those letters was someone worth asking." The wind came off the open plains, and the sign above the station platform creaked on its chains, and somewhere down the street, a horse was making a fuss about something. And Minnie Sawyer stood on that platform and looked at Phineas Finley, and felt the ground shift under her feet in the best possible way. "I should tell you," she said, because honesty had gotten her this far and she saw no reason to stop, "that I am not beautiful in the way my sister is. I am aware that that the original correspondence was meant to be with her, and she is genuinely lovely. I want you to know what you are working with." Something moved in his face. It was not quite a smile, but it was close and it was kind. "I can see what I am working with," he said. "I have been looking at it for the last 30 seconds. I don't have any complaints." She laughed before she could stop herself, and it was a real laugh, the sort that came from somewhere genuine and undignified, and his expression changed completely when she did it, all the careful control of it breaking into something warm and open. "Come on," he said, and he reached for her bags with the natural ease of someone who had decided the practical question and was now getting on with things. "I have a wagon out front, and I ought to warn you Barley is in it." "The dog," she said. "The dog," he confirmed. He was going to stay home, but he saw me getting ready to leave, and his feelings about being left behind are very strong and very loud. They walked off the platform together and into the wide, dusty street of Caldwell, Kansas, and the April sun was warm on the back of her neck, and the sky was the deep particular blue of the plains in spring, and Minnie Sawyer thought, with a certainty she could not have explained to anyone, "I am in the right place." Barley turned out to be a large, ungainly dog of indeterminate breed, with enormous ears that did not match the rest of him, and an expression of profound, unconditional goodwill toward all living things. He launched himself at Minnie the moment she came within range of the wagon, and she caught him with both arms and staggered slightly, laughing again, and Phineas said, "Barley, manners," in the tone of a man who had said this many times before without noticeable effect. "He is wonderful," Minnie said, and meant it. "He will steal your food and sleep on your feet and be entirely unashamed of both," Phineas said, but there was something in his voice when he spoke about the dog that was entirely unguarded, and she filed it away as information. This was a man who loved his dog, and that told her something true about him. The wagon ride to the ranch took the better part of an hour, and they talked the whole way. And it was one of those extraordinary conversations that sometimes happens between two people who have already laid so much of themselves bare in letters that the actual meeting simply picks up where the letters left off, without the usual awkward preamble. She asked him about the ranch, and he described it with the careful precision of someone who had built something and was proud of it, but did not want to overstate its importance. 160 acres of grassland, a main house of 3 rooms plus a kitchen lean-to that he had added himself the previous year, a barn, a bunkhouse where his 2 hired hands, a man named Dupree, and a younger man called Alfie, spent their nights. She told him about the last year in St. Louis, about the trouble with her eyes, about the long calculation she had made and remade about what her future looked like if she stayed. She did not make herself sound more desperate than she had been, but she did not hide it either. "I want you to know I am not here because I had no other choices," she said. "I am here because the choices I had seemed smaller than what I might find here." He nodded slowly, eyes on the road. The grassland rolled away on either side of the wagon track, yellow-green with new spring growth, and the light was doing something extraordinary, lying long and gold across the land. "That's an honest thing to say," he said. "I find honesty tends to be practical," she said, "even when it is uncomfortable." "The letters," he said. Then he stopped and started again. "Those things you wrote about in the letters, your father, those years after he died, were those all true?" "Every word," she said. "Everything except the name was true." He was quiet for a moment, looking at the road. "I know it was wrong," she said. "I know that. I have thought about it a great deal. I told myself I would stop. Every week I told myself I would stop, and then I would receive your letter and I would want to answer it too much to stop." "I'm not reproaching you," he said. "I'm telling you I know. I want you to know that I know, so there's nothing between us that's unaccounted for." He paused. "That's all." The house appeared around a gentle rise in the land, and it was not grand. It was a frame house of weathered wood with a covered porch and 2 windows facing east, and a kitchen addition that had clearly been built with more enthusiasm than expertise, somewhat crooked at one corner. But it was solid and real, and had the look of a place that was genuinely lived in, which she liked far better than grandeur. He helped her down from the wagon with a steadiness she appreciated, his hand brief and careful, and she stood in front of the house and looked at it and thought about living in it. "It needs things," he said, standing beside her looking at it too. "I know it does. I haven't had someone to think about those things with, so it's mostly functional and not much else." "I can make it something else," she said. "I'm a seamstress. I know how to make things look right." "I figured," he said. She looked at him sideways. "You figured. The dress you're wearing," he said without looking at her. "The stitching on the collar, it's very fine work, different from bought work." She realized, delighted by him, and that delight was doing interesting things to her chest. The next 2 weeks were the most interesting of Minnie's life, and she had had an interesting life. She had come to Caldwell as a potential wife, but they had agreed before she arrived that nothing would be decided in a rush, that she would spend a period of time, a month, perhaps more, learning the place and the life and the people, and that they would make their decisions from honest ground rather than the pressure of a situation. This had been proposed in the letters, and she had found it one of the most sensible things she had ever encountered in the context of courtship, which tended historically to involve a great deal of performance and very little genuine acquaintance. So she stayed in a room in the house that had been clearly prepared for her. There was a new quilt on the bed, she noticed, that was not the work of a man, and when she asked about it he told her, somewhat stiffly, that the wife of his neighbor Tom Calloway had made it and that he had paid her for it, and that she had added lavender to the batting because, and here he quoted this in a tone of resigned bewilderment, "Every woman likes lavender." And Minnie had pressed her face into the quilt and inhaled, and thought that Mrs. Calloway was entirely correct. She met the neighbors. She met the Calloways, Tom and his wife Ruth, who was a brisk, practical woman in her mid-30s with clever eyes, and a habit of speaking very directly that Minnie liked immediately. She met the Beaumont Dupree, who was one of Phineas's ranch hands, a man of 40-odd with a weathered Creole face and a quiet dignity that she found immediately compelling. She met Alfie Crane, who was 19 and enthusiastic about everything to a degree that was sometimes exhausting but ultimately endearing. She met the town of Caldwell itself, which was a rough, lively place. The end of the Kishom Trail, she learned, the last real stop before the Texas herds were shipped north, which meant that come summer it was loud and crowded and occasionally dangerous in the way that frontier cattle towns tended to be. The marshal's office stood on the main street, and the marshal, a man named Cutter who was compact and quiet and watchful, nodded at her once when she passed and said, "Miss Sawyer," as though he had already been briefed on her existence and found it unsurprising. She asked Phineas about this later, and he told her that in a small town, anyone who didn't know everything about your business knew about half of it and was guessing the other half, and that she should expect to be a subject of considerable interest for the next several months. "Does that bother you?" she asked. "It's just how it is," he said. "People out here don't have much entertainment." "Does it bother you?" she pressed. "Me being here, people talking." He looked at her directly, which he had a habit of doing, a looking that was unhurried and serious, and that she had decided was one of his most distinctive qualities. "I invited you here," he said. "I stand behind that." It was, she thought, not a declaration of love, but it was something solid, something she could stand on. She threw herself into the practical work of the place because it was what she knew and it was what helped. She had not been afraid of work since she was 15 years old, and she was not afraid of it now. She repaired the curtains in the main room, which had been hanging in a state of structural despair. She reorganized the kitchen, which had been organized according to some system that made sense only to a man who cooked by proximity. Whatever was nearest to hand was what got used, and which she revised into something more logical. She made a new set of dish towels from a bolt of cotton she had brought from St. Louis. She planted a small kitchen garden in the patch of ground behind the lean-to, tomatoes and beans, and a few rows of herbs, working in the mornings while the light was still cool. Phineas watched her do these things with an expression she could not entirely decode, something between appreciation and a kind of wondering attention, as though he was continually being surprised. She caught him watching her one morning when she was working in the garden, his coffee cup in his hand, standing in the kitchen doorway, and he did not look away when she looked up. He just said, "Breakfast is ready," and went back inside, and she sat back on her heels and looked at the small green beginnings of her beans pushing up through the dark earth, and felt something she hadn't felt in years. Something like hope of a specific and personal kind, the kind that has a name on it. She learned the work of the ranch too, not the heavy cattle work, which was not her domain, but the thousand other things that constituted the running of a working property, the mending of tack, the keeping of accounts, which she turned out to have a better head for than Phineas did, a fact he acknowledged with a combination of relief and slight embarrassment. She discovered that he had been losing small amounts of money for 2 years through a combination of honest error and an arrangement with a cattle buyer named Weston that was not as favorable as Phineas believed it to be. She showed him this over the kitchen table one evening by lamplight, the account book spread between them. He leaned over the table beside her, close enough that she could smell wood smoke and leather, and she walked him through the numbers with a patience and clarity that had come from years of managing household money that was never enough. "This arrangement with Weston," she said, tracing a line of figures with her finger. "He is charging you a commission on the sale price and then also taking a fixed fee for transport, but the contract you signed, can I see it?" "Yes, here. This clause here. The commission applies to the gross price before fees, not the net. So you are paying commission on money you never actually receive." Phineas was quiet for a long moment. She could feel the quality of his stillness, which was not the stillness of a man who was not listening but the stillness of a man thinking hard. "He knows that," Phineas said. "He certainly knows that," she agreed. "That arrangement has been in place for 3 years. I see that." He sat back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Then he looked at her. "I need to renegotiate that contract." "Yes, you do," she said, "and I think you should take Beaumont Dupree with you when you do it. He seems like a man who is good at making a point without raising his voice." Something flickered in Phineas's expression that might have been the beginning of a smile. "He is extremely good at that." "Then use it," she said. 3 days later, Phineas renegotiated the contract with Weston, with Beaumont present and very quietly implacable, and came home with better terms. He told Minnie about it that evening on the porch where they had fallen into the habit of sitting after supper, and she listened and then said she was glad, and he looked at her with that steady, serious look and said, "Thank you." "It was just arithmetic," she said. "No," he said. "It wasn't. It was knowing what to look for and knowing what mattered. That's not just arithmetic." The spring deepened toward summer, and the days grew long and warm, and the grassland turned a green so vivid it seemed almost unreal, and Minnie Sawyer found herself, incrementally and then all at once, in love with Phineas Finley in a way that was nothing like she had expected love to feel when she was young and had notions about it. She had expected love to be a sudden, overwhelming thing, a wave, a catastrophe of feeling. What she found instead was something that built slowly and steadily, like a good fire taking hold. The way she noticed things about him that accumulated in her chest with a weight that was not unpleasant. The way he was always the last one to eat because he made sure everyone else was served first. The way he spoke to Beaumont Dupree as an equal, and with genuine respect at a time when that was not an automatic courtesy afforded to a Creole man in Kansas. The way he never once, in all their weeks of acquaintance, said a single dishonest thing to her. Not even a polite dishonesty, not even the kind of small social untruth that everyone accepted as the grease of human interaction. He just said what was true and left room for it. She was aware, in the evenings on the porch, of how close they sat. She was aware of the way their conversations had deepened from the practical to the personal to something that had no category she knew how to name, the way they could sit in silence together, and it was not an empty silence but a full one, occupied by something real. It was Ruth Calloway who said it plainly, because Ruth Calloway said everything plainly. One afternoon in late May, when she had come over to help Minnie put up the first of the kitchen garden's produce, the beans were coming in faster than Minnie had anticipated, and they were working at the kitchen table, and Minnie had said something about Phineas's plan to expand the grazing acreage east of the creek. "You love him," Ruth said, without looking up from the beans she was stringing. Minnie kept her own hands moving. "I have known him for 6 weeks. I knew Tom in 4, Ruth said, and I knew it in 2 if I'm honest. I just needed the other 2 to admit it to myself." Minnie was quiet for a moment. The kitchen was warm and smelled of green beans and the lavender that she had dried in bunches from a plant she had found growing at the side of the house, and outside she could hear the distant sound of cattle and the closer sound of Barley investigating something enthusiastically in the yard. "What if it doesn't work?" she said, which was not a denial. "What does not work mean out here?" Ruth said. "You mean what if he doesn't feel the same way?" "I mean what if all of it falls apart? What if I am not what he needs? What if I came here under a false name, Ruth. I wrote to him as my sister. What if there is always that between us, some doubt about who I actually am?" Ruth put down the beans and looked at her with the directness that was her particular characteristic. "He asked you to come," she said. "He asked you specifically, knowing who you were and what you'd done. That man out there has not had an easy life, Minnie. He lost his father young, he built this place himself from about nothing, and he is not a man who does things carelessly or without knowing why he is doing them. He asked you to come. Think about what that means." Minnie thought about it. She thought about it for the rest of that afternoon and into the evening, and after supper, sitting on the porch in the cooling air with Barley's large warm head on her foot and the sky going spectacular colors over the flat horizon and Phineas in the chair beside her reading a year-old copy of a newspaper he had not yet gotten to, she said without looking at him, "Phineas," he said, "I want to tell you something." He folded the newspaper and set it on his knee and looked at her. That steady look. "I think I am in love with you," she said. She said it simply and directly and without performance because she had learned that from him, this bare and practical honesty, and it seemed right to give it back in kind. "I think I have been for a while. I thought you should know because I do not want there to be something true between us that is not accounted for." He was very still. The sky was turning deep orange along the horizon. "That last part," he said, "that's from my letter." "I know," she said. "It stuck with me." He was quiet for another long moment. Then he said, "I fell in love with you somewhere around the 4th letter. I've been trying to catch up to it since you got off the train." She turned to look at him. He was looking at her with an expression that was open in a way she had not seen on him before, all the habitual careful control of it gone, and he looked younger and more uncertain and more real. "That is a long time to not say anything," she said. "I was waiting to be sure you were sure," he said. "I didn't want to push." "Phineas," she said. "Yes." "Come here," she said. He leaned toward her across the space between their chairs, and she reached up and put her hand against his jaw, rough with the end of a long day's beard, and held it there. And he closed his eyes for just a moment and then opened them and looked at her. And then he kissed her, and it was not a tentative or uncertain kiss. It was the kiss of a man who had been thinking about it for a very long time and had finally been given permission, and Minnie thought very clearly in the middle of it, "Oh, there it is. There is the wave." They were engaged within the week, not because there was a rush, but because neither of them saw any point in continuing to circle something they had already decided. He proposed formally on a Tuesday morning in the kitchen while she was making biscuits, and she said yes before he had finished the sentence, and he laughed in a surprised and delighted way that she had never heard from him before and that she immediately wanted to hear again. But the summer in Caldwell was not all contentment. It was, after all, a cattle town at the end of a trail, and June brought the herds up from Texas and the men who drove them, and the streets of Caldwell became loud and complicated, and the Marshall cutter was stretched thin between the demands of law and the realities of a frontier economy that depended on those drovers and their money even as it feared their behavior. It was in this period that Minnie encountered a situation that required more of her than she had expected. A woman named Della Pine came to her door one morning in early July, referred by Ruth Calloway, and asked if Minnie did alterations. Della was perhaps 25, quiet and careful-eyed, with the kind of watchfulness that spoke of circumstances that required it. She worked in one of the establishments on the south side of town, one of the dance halls that were a permanent feature of Cattle Town commerce, and Minnie understood without it needing to be explained what that meant for a woman in 1883. She brought in 2 dresses that needed work and Minnie did the work. And while she worked they talked, and she learned that Della was originally from Georgia, that she had a daughter of 4 years old who lived with a woman in town while Della worked, and that she had been trying for 2 years to save enough money to leave Caldwell and start somewhere else, somewhere she was not known. She came back the following week with more work, and the week after that, and by August she and Minnie had an arrangement that Minnie had proposed and Della had accepted after several days of suspicious hesitation. Minnie would take in additional sewing work, and half of the income from it would go into a fund for Della, held by Minnie, toward the stake she needed to leave. Phineas, when she told him about this, was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was thinking, and then said, "That's a sound plan," and then said, "Does she need anything else? Work for the ranch, something regular." Minnie looked at him. "You would do that?" "We could use someone in the house," he said practically. "We've talked about that, and a regular wage is more useful to her than irregular sewing income." She crossed the kitchen and kissed him on the cheek, which made him look pleased and slightly startled in a combination she found enormously appealing. Della became, over the course of that summer, something between an employee and a friend, and her daughter, whose name was Grace, became a regular presence on the ranch. A small, serious child who had appointed herself Barley's official keeper, and who took this responsibility with a gravity that delighted everyone. Phineas, who had no experience with small children, approached Grace with the careful, respectful uncertainty he brought to all new situations. And Grace, after approximately 3 days of assessment, decided he was acceptable and began following him around the ranch with the same dedication she brought to Barley, asking questions about cattle with a focus and persistence that he eventually answered with the same straightforward seriousness he brought to all things. "She is going to end up ranching," Minnie told him one evening. "She is 4, he said. "She is 4 and she already knows the difference between a Longhorn and a Hereford," Minnie said. "Some men twice her age could not tell you that." He smiled at her in the particular way he had, which was not a large smile but was entirely real, and she thought, not for the first time and not for the last, "I am the luckiest woman on the plains." Their wedding was set for the last week of September, when the cattle season was winding down and the worst heat of summer had passed. Ruth Calloway took charge of the planning with a brisk efficiency that Minnie found both extremely helpful and occasionally alarming, and the event that was expected to be a small ceremony at the church in Caldwell expanded, through Ruth's organizational enthusiasm, into something that involved nearly the entire community. There was, however, one complication. A letter arrived from St. Louis in mid-September, in Clara's handwriting, and it contained news that Minnie had not expected. Clara and Gerald Holt were coming to the wedding. Minnie read this letter sitting at the kitchen table and felt a complicated wash of emotion, genuine happiness at the thought of seeing her sister, genuine anxiety about the meeting, and something else she needed a moment to identify, which turned out to be a small, old fear that Clara's presence would somehow undo things, that the original version of the story would assert itself. She told Phineas about it that evening. She told him all of it, including the small, old fear, because she had promised herself she would not keep things from him. He listened and then said, "You are not afraid of your sister." "I know that," she said. "You're afraid that I will see your sister and think I chose wrong," he said, not unkindly, just precisely. She looked at her hands. "She is very beautiful." "Minnie," he said, and his voice was so patient and so certain that she looked up. "I wrote to you for 6 months and asked you to come here. I asked you specifically. I watched you step off that train and I thought, there she is. Not the woman from the letters, the actual person. There she is." He paused. "Your sister could be Helen of Troy and it would not change what I know." She held his gaze for a long moment, Then she exhaled. "Helen of Troy is a very high bar," she said. "The principle stands," he said. She laughed, and he reached across the table and took her hand, and held it, and that was that. Clara and Gerald Holt arrived on the Wednesday before the wedding, which gave them 3 days in Caldwell, and the meeting between the two sisters at the train station was emotional in the way that all meetings between people who have shared a history of difficulty and survived it together tend to be, not purely joyful, not purely painful, but real and full and true. Clara was as beautiful as she had always been, fair and vivid, and Gerald Holt was a gentle-faced man with spectacles and a slightly overwhelmed look about him that suggested Caldwell was not entirely what he had expected. Clara took Minnie's hands and looked at her face and said quietly, "You are happy, I can see it." "I am," Minnie said. "I truly am." Clara's eyes went to Phineas, who was standing a few feet behind Minnie with the hat in his hands again in that formally touching way, and Clara studied him for a moment with the frank appraisal of an older sister. "Mr. Finley," she said. "Miss Sawyer," he said, and then with a very small smile, "Mrs. Holt, I suppose." Clara looked at him a moment longer. Then she said, "You are exactly what her letters sounded like." "She told you about me?" he asked. "Every letter," Clara said. "Every single one." Something in his expression shifted in the way it did when he was moved by something, and trying not to show it too obviously. He looked at Minnie, and she looked at him, and Clara, watching this exchange, said nothing more because nothing more was needed. The 3 days before the wedding were full and warm. Clara and Minnie talked for hours, making up for months of distance, and Minnie told her sister the full story. The account books, Della, the kitchen garden, the evenings on the porch, the Tuesday morning proposal in the kitchen over biscuits, all of it. Clara listened and cried a little and then laughed at the biscuits part, and said that was exactly the right way to be proposed to, practical and immediate, no theater. Gerald Holt, for his part, turned out to be an excellent companion for an afternoon of admiring the landscape, which he did with the earnest enthusiasm of a city man encountering space for the first time. And Phineas, who had initially regarded him with the wary politeness one extends to a person connected to a complicated situation, found him genuinely decent company after an afternoon of riding out to look at the grazing land, during which Gerald asked a great many sensible questions about ranching and listened to the answers with real attention. The wedding was held on the last Saturday of September, 1883, and the day was what Kansas could do when it chose to high blue sky, warm sun, the last gold green of the season on the grass, a light wind that carried the smell of the open plains and made the ribbons on the church porch flutter. Minnie wore a dress she had made herself over the past 2 months, ivory cotton with a fitted bodice and a skirt that moved when she walked, and she had done her hair the way she had done it on the morning in the Topeka Hotel when she had looked at herself in the mirror and tried to figure out what she was worth. Standing at the door of the church now, with the sun on her face and Ruth Calloway fussing quietly with the back of her collar, she knew the answer to that question in a way she had not known it then. She was worth exactly this much. Phineas stood at the altar in a dark suit that she suspected was new, or at least newly pressed, and he held himself the way he always held himself, straight, unhurried, looking directly at what mattered, and when she came down the aisle he watched her with that full, unguarded attention that she had come to understand was his version of everything that other men said in words, and when she reached him he said, very quietly, just for her, "You look like yourself." She understood precisely what he meant. She had always known exactly what he meant. "You look like yourself too," she said. The minister read the vows and they said them, and Minnie meant every word of them with the full weight of someone who understood what words were worth and what they cost, and she could see from his face that he meant them the same way. After the celebration at the Calloway place, which was the largest property in the immediate vicinity and could accommodate the number of people Ruth had invited, tables outside in the yard, food contributed by half the county, fiddle music from a pair of brothers from a neighboring ranch, dancing on the packed earth, lanterns strung between the posts. Della was there with Grace, and Grace danced with Barley in the far corner of the yard with complete seriousness and considerable grace. Beaumont Dupree danced with a woman named Mrs. Flores from the edge of town, who had brought 3 kinds of chili pepper to the food table, and who Beaumont had apparently been circling for some time. And Ruth Calloway watched this with visible satisfaction, because Ruth had apparently been engineering this for months. Clara danced with Gerald and watched her younger sister across the lantern-lit yard, and catching Minnie's eye, smiled the smile that only sisters have for each other, the one that contains the whole history of them. Phineas did not dance. He had told her this in advance. He said he danced like a man who had never been given instructions and had improvised the whole thing badly, so she had not expected dancing. What she had not expected was the moment at the edge of the yard when the fiddlers played something slow and he said, "I'll try if you want," in a voice that was completely sincere and slightly terrified. She took his hands. "We do not have to try," she said. "I want to," he said. So they did, and it was exactly as bad as he had promised, and she laughed the whole way through it with her forehead pressed against his chest, and he kept his hands on her waist and endured the laughter with patient good humor, and she thought, "This is my life. This man and this laughter and this wide open sky." The years that followed built themselves the way good lives do, not in moments of pure triumph, but in the accumulation of ordinary days that were, in their ordinariness, extraordinary. The ranch grew. The account books that Minnie kept with her careful hand tracked the progress year by year, the expansion of the grazing land, the improved cattle prices after Phineas renegotiated with a different buyer, the gradual improvements to the house, the kitchen linta properly straightened in the spring of 1884, new windows fitted in 1885, a proper second room added in 1886. Della Pine left Caldwell in the spring of 1884 with enough money saved to buy a small house in Wichita, and a letter of reference from Minnie that was honest and strong, and that helped her find work in a dressmaker's shop, work she was good at, and that suited her. She wrote twice a year after that, short letters full of Grace's latest developments, and Grace, it turned out, grew up with an aptitude for numbers that got her a place in a good school, which Minnie read about in a letter in 1891 and held to her chest for a long moment with a feeling too large for a name. Their first child was a son, born in the February of 1885 on a night when the Kansas wind was doing its worst outside, and the house was warm with lamplight, and they named him James after Phineas's father. He was a difficult baby and a delightful toddler, and grew into a boy who had his father's steadiness and his mother's habit of thinking too carefully about everything, which Phineas once observed was both his best quality and his most exhausting one, and Minnie had laughed and said that was rich, coming from him. A daughter, Eleanor, arrived in 1887, small and fierce and immediately in possession of strong opinions about everything, which she expressed without hesitation from the earliest age. She was interested in the cattle operation from the moment she was old enough to be taken out to see it, which Minnie thought she had predicted, and which Phineas received with a combination of surprise and deep, quiet pleasure. Alfie Crane, who had been 19 when Minnie arrived and had grown into a capable young man, married a woman from a neighboring family in 1886 and built a house on the eastern edge of the Finley acreage, an arrangement that benefited everyone and that had been Phineas's idea, offered to Alfie quietly and without ceremony, which was the way Phineas did most things. Ruth Calloway remained Ruth Calloway, which is to say, a force of considerable nature who inserted herself into every significant event within a 10-mile radius, and whose involvement was always, despite everything, an improvement. She delivered Eleanor, because the doctor from town did not arrive in time, and Ruth arrived with her sleeves already rolled up and said, "Well, this is happening now," with such complete equanimity that Minnie, who was in no position to argue, found herself somehow reassured. Beaumont Dupree married Mrs. Flores, her name was Catalina, it turned out, and she was a widow from New Mexico who had come north with her brother's family. In the fall of 1885, in a ceremony at the church that was attended by half the town, and Phineas was one of the witnesses and came home afterward with a look of warm satisfaction that Minnie recognized as his particular happiness at seeing people he respected get the good things they deserved. There were hard years. The winter of 1886 into 1887 was the worst the plains had seen in living memory, and the cattle losses across Kansas and beyond were devastating for many ranchers. The Finley operation survived, reduced but intact, in part because of decisions Minnie had pressed for the previous summer: a larger hay reserve, a reduced herd going into autumn, more cash held back against emergency. Phineas, who had listened to these recommendations with his characteristic seriousness and implemented them without argument, said to her in the gray aftermath of that terrible winter, looking at the account books that showed them still standing, "You saved this place." "We saved it," she said. "You did the work of it, I just did the arithmetic." "Stop saying that," he said. "You know it's more than arithmetic." She looked up from the account books. He was looking at her with an expression that held so much, the years of it, the weight of it, the genuine deep regard, and she put her hand over his where it lay on the table. "All right," she said. "We saved it." "Yes," he said. "We did." Clara and Gerald Holt came west again in 1888, this time with 2 children of their own, a boy and a small girl, and the house was full in a way that it had never been, and that turned out to suit everyone far better than quiet. James, who was 3, attached himself to Gerald Holt's eldest with the unsentimental practicality of a small boy who has identified a useful friend. And Clara and Minnie spent 3 weeks in a state of continuous conversation that resumed exactly where it had left off each time they had to stop for sleep or meals, catching up on 5 years at once, picking up every thread. Clara looked at the house, at the kitchen garden that was now well established and productive, at the mended and replaced and added to and improved spaces that Minnie had accumulated, and said, "This is very much you." "It was not very much anything when I arrived," Minnie said. "That's what I mean," Clara said. "You turned it into something very much you." One evening during that visit, Minnie and Clara sat on the porch after the children were in bed, and Phineas and Gerald had retreated to the barn on some practical excuse that they both understood was a version of giving the sisters time. The night was warm and clear, and the stars over Kansas were spectacular in the way that you had to live without city light to properly understand, enormous and thick and terribly close. "Are you glad?" Clara asked. "Truly glad, not just contented, but actually glad." Minnie thought about the question the way she thought about important questions, seriously and completely, turning it over to find what was true about it. "I am happier than I have ever been," she said, "and not in a simple way. It is a complicated kind of happiness, full of difficulty and cold winters and impossible cattle prices and the genuine terror of a leaner stubbornness which grows daily." She paused. "But yes, truly glad. I cannot imagine any version of my life that I would have liked better than this one." Clara reached over and took her hand. "I am glad it was you," she said, "that you were the one who wrote back. I have always been glad." Minnie squeezed her sister's hand. "You sent me a good man," she said. "You found a good man," Clara corrected. "In the letters, I just gave you the opening." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and then Clara said softly, "Do you ever think about what would have happened if you had told him from the first letter? If you had just written as yourself?" Minnie considered this. "I think he would have written back," she said. "I think the letters would have been the same. I think we would have arrived at the same place." She paused. "But I do not know if I would have been as honest. I think using your name, terrible as it was and wrong as it was, I think it gave me a kind of distance that let me be more honest than I would have been as myself. As myself, I would have been careful. I would have managed what I revealed. As you," she stopped and smiled at the stars. "As you, I had nothing to lose, and so I gave him everything real." "That is the most Minnie thing you have ever said," Clara said, and they both laughed. James Finley grew up to be a quiet, thoughtful boy who went to the school in Caldwell and distinguished himself in arithmetic and in the kind of steady reliability that made teachers and neighbors speak well of him, and that Minnie recognized as entirely his father's. Alina grew up to be everything Minnie had predicted and more, opinionated and capable and genuinely talented with cattle, which caused Phineas a quantity of quiet, helpless pride that he expressed by including her in more and more of the ranch's work from the time she was 6 years old, explaining things with the same patient directness he brought to everything, treating her seriousness with the seriousness it deserved. It was Alina, at 7 years old, who asked the question that Minnie had half expected and half dreaded, and had nonetheless decided to answer honestly when it came. She asked it at the supper table on a November evening in 1894, with the directness that was her primary characteristic. Why are there letters in the box in the top of the wardrobe with someone else's name on them? The silence at the table had a specific texture. James looked at his sister. James looked at his mother. James looked at his father. Phineas looked at Minnie. Minnie looked at Alina. "Those are letters I wrote," she said, "when I was getting to know your father before I came here." "They say Clara on them," Alina said. "Clara is your Aunt Clara's name," Minnie said. Alina considered this with the focused assessment she applied to everything. "Why do your letters have Aunt Clara's name on them?" Minnie put down her fork. She looked at Phineas, who was watching her with a calm that she understood was complete faith in however she chose to handle this moment. "I used your aunt's name at first because I was afraid," Minnie said. "I was afraid that if I wrote as myself, I might not be as honest as I needed to be. And your father deserved, someone who was going to be entirely honest. So I was. But I used the wrong name while I was doing it." Alina thought about this for a moment. "Were you in trouble for it?" "No," Phineas said from his end of the table in a voice that was entirely calm and certain. "She was not in trouble for it, because what she wrote was true, and true is what matters." Alina looked at her father for a moment. Then she looked at her mother. Then she returned to her supper with the air of a child who has filed information away for future reference and was satisfied for now. James, at the other end of the spectrum of the siblings, said nothing during this exchange and said nothing after. But later that evening, when Minnie was putting out the lamps, she found him sitting in the front room with one of the letters. He must have gotten the box down, reading it with a careful, serious expression. She sat beside him and did not say anything. After a moment he said, "This one is very good." She looked. It was the letter about her father dying. The letter she had written about standing in the kitchen and telling her brothers everything was going to be all right. "I know," she said. "Did you really feel that way?" he asked. "The way you wrote it?" "Yes," she said. He folded the letter carefully and held it. "I'm glad you wrote it," he said, "even if it had the wrong name." She put her arm around her son, and he leaned into her in the way that 10-year-old boys do when they are not performing at being old enough to not need it. And they sat together in the lamplight, and she thought about all the versions of this life that had not happened. The life where she had not answered Phineas's letter. The life where she had answered as herself and been too careful. The life where the train to Caldwell had taken a different track, and found she could not prefer any of them to the specific, particular, irreplaceable fact of this one. In the spring of 1895, Phineas had the house expanded properly, 2 more rooms added on the north side, a proper covered porch all the way around, and new floors throughout, which he had been promising Minnie for 3 years and which she had accepted with patience and received with genuine delight. The expansion was done by a carpenter from Caldwell named Mr. Reyes, who worked with slow precision and extraordinary skill. And during the 3 months of construction, the household was disrupted in ways that Minnie managed with the organizational practicality she had been applying to harder things for 20 years, and that Phineas endured by spending more time than usual outdoors, which was his version of waiting it out. When the new floors were done and the sawdust cleared and the new rooms furnished with the things Minnie had been accumulating with purpose, the new quilt she had made over the winter, the curtains she had sewn for the north-facing windows, The small bookshelf she had built a case for from a crate and a length of salvaged lumber. He stood in the doorway of the main room and looked at all of it. His house that was now something more than a house, and she stood beside him and waited. "Well," he said. "Well," she said. He turned to look at her. 12 years they had been together now, and his face still did to her what it had done on the platform in Caldwell the first time she saw it, that sense of being properly and carefully read. His hair was going gray at the temples. There were lines at the corners of his eyes from years of squinting at the Kansas sun. He was 42 years old and looked every bit of it and nothing of it simultaneously. "It looks like you," he said. "It looks like us," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they stood in the doorway of their house in the Kansas spring, with the sound of a leaner, explaining the finer points of cattle breeding to Mr. Rez's youngest son, who had come to help and was clearly regretting it, and the sound of James practicing the fiddle in the back room with more determination than talent, and the sound of Barley the second, because the original Barley had died in the winter of 1890 at an old age and with great dignity, and had been mourned by the entire household and replaced, after a suitable period, by a puppy that James had named Barley in a fit of sentiment that Phineas had pretended not to be moved by and absolutely had been conducting his ongoing investigations of the yard. "I want to tell you something," he said. The same words she had used 12 years ago on the porch. She looked up at him. "Tell me. I think about that platform sometimes," he said. "The day you got off the train, I had been nervous for 2 weeks." He paused. "I had your letters, all of them. I had read them so many times I knew them. And I stood there thinking, what if she is not who I think she is? What if the person in the letters and the person stepping off the train are entirely different and I have made a terrible mistake?" "And," she said. "And then you stepped off the train," he said. "And you were exactly the same. You looked at me and I could see every single letter you had ever written right there in your face. And I thought—" He stopped. He had the expression of a man working hard to say precisely the thing he meant, which was an expression she loved because it meant he was going to get it right. "I thought the name was never the point. The name was just the envelope. Everything worth knowing was what was inside." She stood very still. "You are every letter," he said. "You have always been every letter, and I am the luckiest man on the plains." "That is my line," she said, and her voice was not quite steady. "I'm borrowing it," he said. She turned into him and put both her hands against his chest and felt the solid, steady beat of him. This man she had written to in her sister's name and found with her own heart. And she thought about the letter she had written at 18 years old about her father dying, and how she had told her brothers everything was going to be all right when she did not believe it herself, and how, in the end, it had turned out to be true, not immediately, not easily. Not without the long, winding road of a plan that was foolish and a name that was wrong and a train journey into an unknown country, but true. Everything in the end had been all right, more than all right. She looked up at him. The Kansas spring light was coming through the new windows she had chosen and laying long gold bars across the new floor she had waited for. And outside a leaner was still explaining cattle and James was still mangling the fiddle and Barley the second was still pursuing his investigations with total commitment. And Phineas Finley was looking at her the way he had looked at her on that platform in 1883, steady and complete and certain, and she thought, there he is. There he always is. "I love you," she said. "I know," he said. "Phineas." "I love you too," he said. "I have loved you since the 4th letter. I expect I will love you until there are no more letters left to write." She thought about writing him a letter, not a letter with anyone else's name on it. A letter with hers, Minnie Finley, as she was now, to tell him everything that had accumulated in 12 years of an ordinary, extraordinary life together. The account books and the kitchen garden, Alina and James, Barley 1 and Barley 2, the bad winter and the renegotiated contracts, the lavender in the new quilt and the evenings on the porch, and the dancing at their wedding that had been genuinely terrible and entirely perfect. The whole long accumulation of days that were the only thing a life actually was, but she thought she would save it. She thought she would write it on their 20th anniversary and their 30th, and however many anniversaries there were after that, because that was the kind of woman she was, someone who put things into words and meant every one of them. And because he was the kind of man who would read every letter as carefully as he had read the first, with the full weight of his serious, unhurried attention. For now, she simply stood in the doorway of her home in the spring of 1895 and held onto the man she had found by writing under the wrong name and arrived to find already known, and was completely, unreservedly, wholly glad. The years rolled on in the particular way of Kansas years, wide and weathered and full of light. James, at 16, showed a gift for negotiation that Minnie recognized as her own, and that expressed itself in his handling of the cattle sales with a precision that made buyers twice his age sit up and reconsider their assumptions. Phineas watched his son operate at the cattle pens one autumn afternoon with an expression that he could not entirely contain, which was the expression of a man seeing himself in someone else and finding it both strange and wonderful. Alina, at 14, was already indispensable to the ranch in ways that went beyond what anyone had expected, though Minnie had expected most of it. She had a feel for the cattle that was almost instinctive, a quick and accurate read of animal temperament that Beaumont Dupree, who was the best judge of cattle on the property, said was the rarest thing you could train for and couldn't, meaning you either had it or you didn't. Alina had it comprehensively. Beaumont and Catalina Dupree had 3 children of their own now, and the oldest, a boy named Victor, was 2 years older than James and had been his closest friend since they were small, which was a friendship that Phineas had encouraged with the same quiet deliberateness with which he encouraged all things that seemed right and true. Minnie continued to keep accounts, not just for the Finley ranch but, by 1897, for 3 neighboring operations as well, because word of her competence had spread in the efficient way that all information spreads in rural communities, and she had accepted these additional responsibilities with the stipulation that she would be paid properly for them, which she was. She had learned in the years since her arrival that the best time to establish what you were worth was at the beginning, before anyone had gotten comfortable with paying you less. She still sewed. She always sewed. She found it the best thinking work, the kind that occupied the hands and freed the mind, and she had made every piece of significant clothing the household had worn for 15 years. James's good suit for his first day at the county school, Alina's dresses which Alina wore with complete indifference to their excellence, Phineas's wedding anniversary shirt in the dark blue she had decided early on was his color. She had made, over the years, quilts for the Calloways and the Duprees and Alfie Crane's family, and a family of newcomers who arrived in 1893 with very little and needed warmth against their first Kansas winter. She wrote to Clara twice a year without fail, and Clara wrote back, and the letters between them were the steady baseline of both their lives, the through line that connected the 2 sisters across the distance they had made between them, which was a geography and not a closeness. The last letter Minnie ever wrote about Caldwell was not to Clara. It was to a young woman in St. Louis whose name she had been given by a friend of a friend, a young woman who had seen a matrimonial advertisement and was uncertain whether to respond, and who had been told that Minnie Finley, formerly Sawyer, of Caldwell, Kansas, might have useful perspective. Minnie sat at the kitchen table on a March evening in 1900, with the lamp burning and Barley too asleep under the table and the sound of Phineas reading aloud to Alina in the front room. Alina claimed she was too old for this, but continued to accept it, and she wrote, "I will tell you what I know, which is this. The distance between a letter and a life is very small if the letter is honest. I came west on a train in 1883 with 2 bags and a set of letters written under the wrong name, and I found the right life at the other end of them. I do not recommend the wrong name. It is a complication and a weight, and you will carry it until you put it down, and you had better put it down quickly. But I do recommend the honesty that filled those letters, however they were addressed. Say what is true about yourself. Say what you are afraid of and what you love and what you have been through and what you want. Say all of it. A man worth going to will read it the way it is meant, and a man who is not worth going to will reveal himself by what he does with what you said. I stepped off a train in April of 1883, and the man waiting on the platform already knew who I was. He had known for months. He had been waiting for me specifically, the person inside the letters and not the name on them. That is the kind of man worth the train ride. I hope you find yours. She folded the letter and addressed it and set it with the outgoing post. And then she sat for a moment in the quiet of the kitchen in the life she had made. The walls that held 12 years of ordinary, extraordinary days. The smell of wood smoke and lavender and the good Kansas spring coming through the window she had cracked open because the air had turned soft. And she was content in a way that had no drama to it, no performance, no borrowed name. Just the plain and permanent fact of a woman in the right place, at the right table in the right life, with her own name on it. Phineas came into the kitchen a few minutes later, done with reading, his book still in his hand. He looked at her at the table. "Barley is on the bed," he said. "Barley is always on the bed," she said. "I have told him, you have told him 1,700 times," she said. "He finds the information interesting and irrelevant." He sat across from her at the table where the account books lived and where they had spent so many evenings over so many years, and he looked at her the way he had always looked at her, full and steady and complete. "What are you thinking about?" he asked. She looked at him, the lamplight on his gray-templed hair, the lines at the corners of his eyes. The hands on the table that she knew better than she knew her own, the scar on the right one from a barbed wire incident in 1889, the way the left thumb bent slightly from an old break that had healed slightly wrong. "I was thinking about the train," she said. "Which train?" he said, though she thought he knew. "The one in 1883, she said. "April, coming into Caldwell." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I wore my good coat." "You had your hat in your hands," she said. "You were not wearing it, you were holding it." "I was nervous," he said. "I know," she said. "I was terrified." "You didn't look terrified." "I was terrified on the inside," she said. "I was holding it together on the outside out of pure stubbornness." Something in his expression shifted into the warmth that was, she thought, his most extraordinary quality, not spectacular, not performed, just genuinely and quietly warm in the way that a good fire was warm, constant, and real. "You have always held it together out of pure stubbornness," he said. "Is that a compliment?" "It is the highest compliment I know," he said. She reached across the table and took his hand, and he turned his hand over and held hers, the way he had that first evening over the account books, and the way he had 1,000 times after, and the way she intended he would 1,000 times more. Outside, the Kansas night was clear and enormous and full of stars, and the spring wind was moving through the new grass, and Barley, too, was almost certainly on the bed, and Alina was likely reading by candlelight past her bedtime, and James was probably asleep with a book on his chest, and somewhere to the north the lights of Caldwell were small and steady against the dark, and the Finley house was warm and lit and entirely itself. Minnie Sawyer Finley, who had come west on a train with her sister's name on a set of letters and her own heart in her chest, held her husband's hand in the kitchen of the life she had made, and was home.